Hello everyone, this is the Algebra 1 Thursday assignment, and the directions say determine if the following relations are functions. A relation is just an ordered pair of set of coordinates together is a relation. Determine if the following relations are functions. Remember, if the x repeats, it's probably not a function, so you're looking at the x's first, and then you look at the y's to see if every x must have its own y. The domain is the list of all the x's. The range is the list of all the y's. So it says list the domain and range. Is this a function? First off, we're looking at the x's first. The x does repeat, so we're just going to go like this: x, 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 and x. The x does repeat. This is not a function. The domain is a list of all of the x's. So in order, so -2 from least to greatest, -1 and 1 without repetition. You see that there are two ones. You do not list that. The range is a list of all of the y's from least to greatest. So we have -2, 0, 2, and 3. For this one, we're going to look at all the x's, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Yes, this is a function because all of the x's have their own y. So the domain is a list of all of the x values, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And the range is a list of all the y's, 1, 2, 5, 10, 15. They're already in order, so that is pretty easy. And that's it. For number 3, we're looking at 17 for the x, and 17 does not repeat. 15 over 4 does not repeat 15. 17 over 4. So is this a function? Yes. So we are listing in the domain 15 over 4 first, because that's the least. 17 over 4 second. And you can put a check mark for using those x's. And then the next one is 15. And the next one is 17. None of the x's repeat, so that's why it is a function. Every x has its own y. The range itself, we're going to list 15 over 4 first because that's the least. We are going to go to 17 over 4 next. That's listing order from least to greatest. So we got this, we got this, we got this. We don't have 17. We do have 15 because I'm going to put it down now, and 17. So it's the same exact thing as the domain. Again, we're going to look at -3, -3 right away. It is not a function. The reason why it's not a function is because the y that repeats, it goes to the x that repeats goes to two different y's. So when we list this domain, we have a -3 first. We are not going to list the second -3. Then we're going to go 3 over 2. That's next. And then 5 is the greatest number there. The range is a list of all the y's. So we're going to list the -5 first because that's the least. Then the 2 over 5. And then the 3 over 5, listing from least to greatest. Identify the graphs below that are functions. So we're going to list the coordinates first, and the coordinates here are -2, 2. That's this one. negative 1, 1. That's this one. We're going to go to 1, 0. We're going to go to 1, 1. That's that. And then we're going to go to 1, 2, 3, x 3, right 3, down 2. And then right 3, up 3. So we are going to say that this is not a function because, again, we have the x repeating going to two different y's. So no. The domain we're going to list starting with the negative 2, with the x, negative 1. We're going to list the 1 only once. We're not going to repeat it. And then we're going to list the 3 only once. The y, we're going to go and look for a negative, which is negative 2. And then the next one down is 0. The next one up, I should say, is 0. Then after that is 1, 2, and 3. Right? So for the coordinates here, we have negative 2, 3. We have 0, 1. We have 2, negative 1. And then we have 2, negative 2. This is a function. Well, no, it's not. Yes, it is. So we have 2, negative 2. We have 3, negative 2. This is a function. The domain is negative 2, 0, and 2, and 3. The range, we're going to look for the lowest value, negative 2, negative 1, 1, and 3. And that's it. Number 7, the coordinates, negative 2, 0, left 2, up 0, negative 1, 2, 1, 2, and then 2, 0. Is this a function? Yes, it is. The x's don't repeat. Every x has its own y. The domain is negative 2, negative 1, 1, and 2. Domain. Range, list of all the y's, 0, only once, it occurs twice, and then 2. Just like that. All right, the coordinates here, we're going to start with negative 2, negative 2. Then we're going to go to negative 2, negative 4. We're going to go to 1 to the right, negative 1, and then 1. That's a negative 1, 1. Let me erase that because it does look like a 7. And then we have a 1, negative 2. And then the last one I'm going to squeeze in there is 3, 0. The function, is it a function? It has two. If you did the vertical line test, you could see that it'll go through these points, so it is not a function. If you're listing the domain, it is negative 2, only once, negative 1, 1, and 3. The range, the set of all y's, we're going to start with -4 because that is the least, -4, and then we're going to go to -2 only once, -2, and then 0, and then 1. For the relations expressed as mapping diagrams, express the relations as mapping diagrams. We're going to ask if it's the function or not. We're just going to put all of the x's in the first mapping diagram and the y's in the second. We're not going to label them, we're not going to order them from least to greatest. We are just going to put them in and then draw the lines. So the y's are -1, 3, 4, and 3. So you don't repeat. So we're going to get rid of that 3 and then just leave that the way it is. All right? So we don't list numbers twice. So I'm going to erase that -2. So here's 0, and I'm going to go and draw a line to 3. 0, 3. The 5 goes to 4. The -2 goes to -1, and the -2 also goes to 3. So that's your mapping diagram. I'm going to go again and put the x and the y in for here. And remember, these are my x's. So I'm going to have -1, 0, 2, and 3. Then I'm going to list 5, 3 only once because it occurs once, and then it occurs twice. I'm going to only list it once, and I'm going to list -1 once. So -1 goes to 5, 0 goes to 3, 2 goes to 3, and 3 goes to -1. So let's go back to this. Do you see how the x, this -2, actually picks 2 different numbers? This x goes to 2 different y's. It is not a function. This is a function. Every x has its own y. Just to move it down just a little bit, the domain would be, again, 0, -2, and 5. The range would be -1, 3, ordered from least to greatest, and 4. The domain here would be -1, 0, 2, 3. Listing from order from least to greatest. And then the range would be -1, 3, only once, even though it's repeated, and 5. Going down to number 11, I'm going to list the x's, -1, 0, and 1. I'm not going to list this 0 again. I'm not going to repeat, which is 7, -3, 10. And then 7 repeats again. We're not going to repeat it. -1 goes to 7, 0 goes to -3, 1 goes to 10, and then 0 goes to 7 as well. So we're going to draw a second line. This is not a function. The domain is basically this: -1, 0, only once, and 1. And the range is -3, 7, and 10. For this, we're going to put a half, 1/4, 1/8. We'll squeeze it in -1/2. And then we're going to have 2 listed only once because 2 is repeated. So we're going to put that right there. And every single one of these goes to 2. This is a function. The domain is a half, negative a half, 1/4, 1/8, 1/4, listing from least to greatest, and then 1/2. And then the range is 2. Number 13, it's asking to see what the domain, now the graphs are a little bit more difficult. So we'll just go ahead and do the vertical line test to see if it's a function. It is a function. It only goes through once. So the domain, where we're talking about just the x values, we're going to talk about looking at the very left of the graph. This is a negative 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I'm going to put down that this right here, and I can't even see if this is a, yes it is, it's a closed circle. So -5 is here. So I'm going to put that as a -5, and that is the left side of my graph. So my left side, it doesn't go any further than this. We're talking about the x-axis only, so the domain is the x-axis. So at the right side of my graph, this finishes off right here, so that's 7, and it is a closed circle, so that is a bracket. The range, we're talking about up and down, so this is the y, this is the y. So the lowest that the graph goes is -9. So we're going to put -9. -9 is the lowest that the graph goes, and the highest is 9. And we put a bracket for that because it is a shaded dot there. All right. And so now we're going to take a look at this right here, and we're going to just say let me just move my face over. All right. So we have the domain. I'm going to put some points right here, domain X. So this graph does not stop, right? It continues up. It goes all the way up. As you could tell, I put those points there. There are no points. It just continues going. It should have arrows, but it doesn't. When it continues going like this, though, the graph is continuous. From this one, it doesn't stop here. It just keeps on going to the right. So we say -infinity, and it's a parenthesis. And then the graph keeps on going to the right and left. All right, so the graph, this part of the graph goes to the left, this part of the graph goes to the right. So it is infinity in both directions, and that is what your answer is for domain. The range is something different. The lowest part of this graph is 2. So we're going to say that this is 2, and it's a bracket because it hits the 2, and even without a solid point, you're basically saying that it's definitely 2. That is 0, 2 as a coordinate, so 2 is included in this graph. As this goes up, the highest point of this graph, the highest point is infinity because it just keeps on going. Is this a function? Yes, it is. It is a function. Taking a look at number 15, we're going to look at this domain and range. So domain is the list of all x's. So we are going to see, we're going to say to ourselves, what's the point that's the most left, the leftmost part of this graph? It goes on forever. So that is when it goes on forever, it is -infinity. When it goes on forever to the right, that is called positive infinity. So you could see that this part right here, this is positive infinity, and this is negative infinity. All right, the range, we're going to talk about now. The lowest part of this graph is this right here. That's a 5. That's a -5. So the -5 is the lowest part of the graph. But what's the highest part of this graph? It just keeps on going all the way up. So remember, that is positive infinity. And yes, this is a function. If you did a vertical line test, it would only go through once. Here's the domain. The domain, the leftmost part of this graph continues on forever. So we're going to talk about negative infinity. The rightmost part of this graph goes on forever. You're going to talk about positive infinity. The range, you're talking about the lowest part of the graph. The lowest part of the graph, by the way, this is -1. That right there is the lowest part of the graph. That is -1. So we're going to put -1, and it reaches -1. It hits -1 a number of times. So you don't even need to see a closed circle. You just need to see that it hits -1 a number of times. It also hits +1 as the highest point of the graph, and that means it's that. This is a function. If you did a vertical line test, it only goes through once. All right, so number 17, domain, we're going to talk about the x's. So what is the leftmost part of this graph? Let's go all the way to the left and stop right there. That is a -8. That is a closed circle. So we are going to put a bracket. We're going to go to the right of, like the rightmost part of the graph is 2 on the x-axis, and that is a closed circle. So we have a +2, no infinity here. So the range, again, is the lowest part of the graph. That's where I'm going. Here's the lowest part of the graph. I have a -5, the lowest part. The highest part of the graph is 8, right? You're going to the y. So that is 8. And we have a closed circle on both of those. And that is a function. If you did a vertical line test on that, you would see it's a function. For number 18, the domain, we're talking about the leftmost part of the graph first. It starts at 0 on the x-axis. So we're going to put 0 and we're going to put a bracket because, again, that's where it starts. All right, and that's it. You don't need a solid circle the filled in circle to see that. It is starting at 0. The rightmost part of the graph is 6 and it ends there. So we're going to put 6 in a bracket. The range, the lowest part of this graph is here. No, it's not. Wow. All right, so the lowest part of the graph we could say is about here. All right, so we're going to say that that is, I'm sure it's meant to be 6. All right, so we're just going to say it's -6. That's the lowest part of the graph. It might be -7, but who cares? Doesn't matter. You know what it is. All right, this part of the graph right here is the highest part of the graph, and it looks like 18 to me, and that is definitely included. So we put a bracket on there. Is this a function? Yes. If we did a vertical line test, it would only go through once. All right, number 19. This is not a function. The reason why it's not a function is because if you did a vertical line test, it would cross twice. All right, every x does not have its own y. So we're going to take the domain, the value of the x's. What is the leftmost part of the graph? It goes to -2. So that is a bracket -2. It touches -2. So that means -2 is included in this domain. And then it goes forever to the right. So forever to the right is positive infinity. So That's what it is, and it is parenthesis. That is a really bad infinity symbol. All right, so the y, the lowest part of this graph, is this, and it continues on that way. So the lowest part of the graph is negative infinity. The highest part of the graph, it continues on this way, is positive infinity. So it is negative infinity, positive infinity. All right, number 20, this is a function. So it goes, what's the leftmost part of the graph? We're looking at the x's. It is negative infinity, the leftmost part. The right is positive infinity. This is negative infinity. This is positive infinity. Right? Goes to the right and left forever. The same thing for the y, the range. It's the set of all y's. Goes down forever. That's a negative infinity. That's what you list first. And this is up. It is positive infinity. That's what you list second. And that's it. So the domain here, this is a function, yes. If you did a vertical line test, it only goes through once. It is a function. So we're going to look at the leftmost part of the graph because we're looking at the x, and we're looking at the rightmost part of the graph. This is negative infinity because it goes on forever in that direction, and this is positive infinity. It goes on forever in that direction. The range, the lowest part of this graph is -1. That's here. That's -1. So we're going to put that -1 down first, and it hits -1, so that's a bracket. And then the highest point of this graph is 1, and it hits -1. It hits +1, so that's a bracket. For number 22, this is not a function. The reason is if you did the vertical line test, it crosses twice. So every x does not have its own y. So if we're looking at the domain, we're looking at the leftmost part of the graph first. This is -1, this is -2. So put -2 down, and it is a bracket. This is 2, that's the rightmost part of the graph, and that is +2. The range is the lowest first. We're going to go to the lowest first. That is -2. And then we're going to go to the highest, and that is 2. So the range and domain are the same. This is a function. Did a vertical line test. It crosses only once. The domain itself, the leftmost part of the graph goes on forever. So we're going to put negative infinity going that way. And we are going to put positive infinity because it goes to the right forever as well. The range, we're going to go to the lowest part of this graph. The lowest part of this graph is -1, and it touches -1, so we have a bracket. And then it goes up forever. So that means that this is positive infinity. For this one, this is not a function. If you did a vertical line test, it would cross twice, more than once. The domain, the leftmost part of the graph, the furthest it goes to the left is 0. Remember, it stops there, right? There are no arrows on this one, and it stops. So it doesn't continue. It would have continued if they wanted it to, if they wanted to show that it continued. So we're going to put 0. So the 0, since it touches 0, that is a bracket. The rightmost part of the graph is 2. So we're going to put a 2, and it touches 2, so that's included in the domain. the range is the lowest part. So this is the lowest part right there. So we're going to have -2, and it touches -2. So that's a bracket. This 2 is the highest part of the graph. So it touches it, and it's a bracket. And this is not a function. For number 25, this is definitely not a function. If you did your vertical line test, it would cross definitely more than once. So every x does not have its own y. And I'll erase this just because I don't want to get anybody confused. So the domain is a list of all the x's. I'm going to go to the left first. The left shows an arrow going forever in that direction. So the x-axis is a negative infinity. This arrow shows that it goes to the right forever on the x-axis. That is a positive infinity. The range going down low, the lowest point of the graph is -1. The highest point of the graph is 1. All right, since it touches that graph at the lowest point at -1 and highest point at 1, that means they get brackets. For number 26, we have a function. Is this a function? You do a vertical line test. Yes, it is a function. The domain is the leftmost part of the graph is -2. So that's the domain. We're going to start at -2. It's a closed circle, so it's a bracket. We're going to go all the way over to the rightmost part of the graph. There's an arrow facing up. That means it goes to the right forever. That is a positive infinity. So that's the reason why it is a positive infinity there. We are talking about range, so we're going to go immediately to the lowest part of the graph. The lowest part of the graph is 4, -4, and that is touching -4, so we have a bracket. And then we're going to be, this line is going to be pointing upward, and it's going to go upward forever. And since it goes upward forever, we have a positive infinity. So positive infinity, and then you put a parenthesis around the positive infinity. Is this a function over here? Yes, it is. You did a vertical line test. It'll cross only once. It starts, if you go into the domain, you're talking about this x-axis. We're going to go to the -2. That is the leftmost part of the graph. Since it is a closed circle, we are putting a bracket around it. We are going to go all the way to the right here, and to the right is positive infinity. There's the arrow. It keeps on going to the right, so we have positive infinity. The range is the lowest part of the graph. The lowest part of the graph is 1. So it hits 1, so we have a bracket. The highest point of the graph looks like 4. Then it goes down. Then you see this arrow. It continues up forever. So that means it is positive infinity. All right, just remember, if it continues up forever, that means this is a positive infinity. You're on the y. So this line continues, continues, continues. Look at the y. It's continuing all the way up. All right, that is positive infinity. Number 28, you're taking a look at, is this a function? Yes, you do the vertical line test right away. It's a function. It only crosses once. We have a domain. So we're going to look on the x-axis right here. We're going to look at the x-axis, and we see that on the x, it starts at 4. So we're going to put a parenthesis and a 4 because that's an open circle. Then it goes in this direction and an arrow up forever. So that means on the x, it's a negative infinity. The range, you're going to go to the lowest part of the graph and you get -16. It's an open circle, so we put parentheses, and then we're going to go to infinity right here. All right, and we are going to erase that because that was a mistake right there. So I started here, all right, for the y. That's the lowest part of the graph. So that's -16. And then I went to the highest point of the graph, and let me just raise this up a little bit. The highest point of the graph is positive infinity, right? Because it goes in this direction forever. So just remember, negative 16 has an open circle, so I'll put that back, and then it goes to positive infinity. All right, it's negative 16 in positive infinity. For this one over here, again, is this a function? No, because if you did a vertical line test right here, it would cross like 3 times, so not a function. The domain is the list of all x's. So we're going to go all the way over here. This is negative on the x-axis. This is a negative infinity. And you see this arrow? It's going to go in this direction the whole time. So it's positive infinity. So you have negative infinity, positive infinity, and you have the parentheses around that. Same thing for the y. The lowest part of this graph is negative infinity, all right, because it just keeps on going. And then the highest point of this graph is the positive infinity because it keeps on going in that direction. So we are going to have negative infinity and positive infinity. For number 30, is this a function? Yes, it is. All right, and then the domain, the leftmost part of this graph, it continues on with an arrow. So that's negative infinity. So we're going to talk about negative infinity, and where it starts on the x-axis is 3. And that is a parenthesis because it's an open circle. The range is the lowest part of this graph is negative infinity. It goes down forever. Look at the y. And then the negative infinity gets listed first. And then the highest part of the graph is 16. So 16 is the parenthesis as well. Gets the parenthesis, I should say. For number 31, it is a function. The domain starts here. We're talking about the x-axis, so we have negative 4. And that is a closed circle, so it's a bracket. And it goes in this direction forever. So it is a positive infinity. For the range, the lowest part of this graph is negative infinity. It goes in that direction forever. So we're going to put parenthesis, negative infinity. And then the highest point of this graph is 2. And we put a bracket because it's a closed circle. Is this one a function? Yes, it is. The domain, we're going to go all the way to the left of the x-axis, and that's 3. So we're going to start with 3, and we have a parenthesis because it's open circle. Then it goes in this direction forever. So that is positive infinity, and that is a parenthesis. The lowest part of the graph is 4. It's an open circle, so it's a parenthesis. And then the highest point of the graph continues on forever, so that is a positive infinity. Remember, this denotes positive infinity if it goes on and on forever in an upward direction. Number 33. Number 33 has this going on. Is this a function? You do the vertical line test, and you see quickly that it only goes through once. Domain, though, we're going to go to the leftmost part of this graph. It is at negative 40. So we're going to put, that's a closed circle. So we're going to put negative 40. Then the rightmost part of the graph is positive infinity. It goes on and on forever. So that is positive infinity with the parenthesis. The range, we're going to go to the lowest part of the graph. This is already going all the way down, so this is negative infinity down here. The highest point of this graph is 2. Negative 2, sorry. So that's negative 2. And we're going to put a bracket because, because it reaches negative 2, and negative 2 is a part of that range. All right, you're going to take a look at this one right here. It goes straight down. This is a vertical line, right? This is not a function. Not a function. All right. Draw a vertical line on that. It hits like a million times. The x repeats and goes to different y's. All right. So there you go. So the domain. So just remember when we said this in class. Let me move myself over here. There are a couple of different ways to write this. The domain stays on 6. So if we're talking about 6 and we're talking about x equals 6, that's the line. Or you could write it like this. And in some textbooks, no, like you could write it like that. All right, 6, x equals 6, or 6 in braces. The range, though, the highest point, the lowest point of the graph is negative infinity. The highest point of this graph is 15, and it's a parenthesis because it's an open circle. All right, so it says state the domain and range. Let me just mess with this page width for a second. All right, and state whether it's discrete. We're not going to do that, continuous or neither. So we're not going to worry about that. We're just going to worry about what we've studied so far, domain, range, and function. So if we're talking about the domain, range, and function, we're saying that this is not a function. All right, because again, if you do the vertical line test, an x repeats and goes to 2 different y's. So the domain, though, is the leftmost part of the graph. We haven't studied because, again, it is not a continuous graph, and we've only studied continuous graphs. So this is -3, and you could put a brace on it, a brace around it, and this is +2, and you could put a brace around it. We haven't studied that, so don't freak out about it. The range is all the way down, which is negative infinity, and all the way up, which is a positive infinity. So the negative infinity goes first, and the positive infinity goes second. The domain for this one, again, this is more of a little bit easier. This is a function, yes, you do a vertical line test, it only goes through once. The leftmost part of the graph is -5, so we're going to put a -5 here. It's an open circle, so we're going to put a comma. The leftmost part of the graph is 5, so we're going to put a bracket because it's a closed circle. That's the x-axis. Now we're going to switch to the y for the range. The lowest part of this graph is -2. And you see that this is a closed circle and this is an open circle. So -2 is a part of the graph because of this closed circle. So we're going to have -2 here, and we're going to have a bracket on that -2. And then it goes all the way up to 2, so it's a bracket on 2. The highest point of the graph is 2, and that is that. Is this a function? Yes, it is. All right, vertical line test only shows that it only goes through once. The leftmost part of this graph is the negative infinity. The rightmost part of the graph is the positive infinity. This is the leftmost part of the graph. The rightmost part of the graph, it goes on forever in both directions. The range is the same thing. The lowest part of the graph is negative infinity. The highest part of the graph is positive infinity. So it goes on forever in both of those directions. So that's how you list it. Number 38 is a straight line. The straight line right here, this is what we're talking about, horizontal. So if you really want to put down, obviously, this is a function. Yes. The domain is a negative infinity on the x and a positive infinity on the other side of the x. So it goes in both directions. Forever. The range is only one number, so you could put y equals 3, or you could put the braces with 3 around it. For number 39, all right, and then this one right here, it is a function. If you did a vertical line test here, you would see that it is a function. I'm just going to list all of the coordinates just to make sure that you know that where I'm getting that domain. Actually, I'm not going to list all the coordinates. I'll just give you the domain here. This is -3, and I'm getting it from this x. This is -2. This is 1. I'm just giving the x coordinates. This is 2, and this is 5. And I'm getting the domain from all of the x coordinates. The range, I'm going to go -3. I'm going to go to the bottom one, which is -5. I'm going to go to 0 on the y-axis, and then I'm going to go to 1 on the y-axis, listed only once, and then 4 on the y-axis. That's the range. So I did that kind of like on the fly, and that's basically it. So we're talking about domain here, and this is of a graph again. So we're going to go, it just answer that it is a function right away because you're doing your vertical line test. The domain, the leftmost part of this graph, the leftmost part is just going in that direction forever. So that is a -infinity. The rightmost part starts at 4, so we're going to have 4, and we're going to put a bracket. The range itself is the lowest part of the graph is at 0, so we're going to put a bracket because it touches that 0 on the y-axis, and it goes on forever in this direction, so that means it continues up in that direction, so you have a positive infinity. That is number 40. All right, so 41, we're just going to take a look. This is not a function. It crosses twice, the vertical line test. So we're just going to go to the leftmost part of the graph on the x-axis. This is a 2, -2. And we're going to put a bracket because it touches that -2. And then the rightmost part of the graph is 2. And we're going to put a bracket because it touches that part. Then we're going to go to the lowest part of the graph, which is 1, and it touches that part, so we're going to put a bracket, and then the highest point of the graph is 5, and that is the range. The next one, which is 42, we are the function, is it a function? Yes, it is. The domain is like the rightmost part, the leftmost part of the graph goes on forever in the -infinity. The rightmost part of the graph is positive infinity. So we have -infinity and positive infinity and parentheses. The range is the lowest part of the graph, which is 0. And then so it touches the 0, so that is a bracket. And then the highest point of the graph is a positive infinity. And that's it, right? Okay, so this right here is not a function. Remember, if you do that vertical line test, it'll cross more than once. The leftmost part of the graph is right up here, so that's -4. It touches -4, so we're going to say that that is a bracket, -4. And then the rightmost part of the graph for the x is a 3. It's an open circle, so it's a parenthesis. The lowest part of the graph is a -5, so we're going to put a -5 there with a parenthesis. The highest part of the graph is a +5 with a parenthesis because it's an open circle. All right, so for this one, they're only asking determine which relations below are functions. Find the number of each relation that is a function at the bottom of the page, and then cross out the letter below it that is a function. So when you finish, answer the title. The answer to the title question will remain when it backed into a cactus, question mark. What did the baby porcupine say when it backed into a cactus? So let's just go through and see which ones are functions and label them. So we have 1, 2, so nothing repeats. This is a function. So it says find the number of each relation that is a function. So 1 is a function. So we're going to go all the way down and we're going to cross that out. And then we're going to go back up and we're going to see -7, 3, 0, -2, 6, -6, 4. This is a function. So we're going to cross number 2 out. Four, -3, 9, 2, -4, 2, 2, -1, 2, 7, not a function. So we don't have to cross anything out on that one. So just taking a look at all of the x's do not repeat. This is a function. So we have to go down and cross number 4 out. Number 5, -1, 3, 5, function. So we cross number 5 out. -2, -2, not a function. Vertical line test function, vertical line test, only once, only once, only once, only once, only once. This is a function. Right, that's a function. This is a function. So we're crossing 8 out as well. This right here, we're going to do vertical line test. Vertical line test, that's once. This is twice, not a function. Not a function. Crosses twice, not. Crosses once, function. Crosses once, function. So we have to cross 11 and 12 out. And that's about it. So these are my results. I don't understand what that means, but okay. It says Hima. All right. All right. So last page here, we got the collection of all output values is called the blank of the function. So what are the output values called? These are the y's. So that is called the range. The input values x, domain. Identify the domain and range of the function. So domain, we're going to do 1, 3, 5, 7. And range, We're going to do 5, 6, 7, and 8. The domain is 2, 3, 5, 7, listing from least to greatest. And then the range, listing from least to greatest, is 1, 2, 4, and 5. Nothing repeats, so you're just listing least to greatest for the domain. Okay, that's not how you spell it. Nothing repeats, so we're just going to list from least to greatest: 0.4, 0.5, 0.6, and 0.7. The range, listing from least to greatest, we're going to start with 9, 11, 13, and 15. No repetition, so it's pretty easy, straightforward. Number 6, here we go with the x's. So we're going to list all the x values. So it's 0, 1, only once. So we're going to, I'm going to just underline all of the x's that I used. So there's 2, and then 3. And notice that I have a -2 hanging out over here. So I am just going to go and erase this and put -2 in. And that would be it. The range would be the y. So that's a -1. And then we have a 2. And we have 2 twice. So I'm using that. And then we have 5, 6, and 7. Domain for this, the least is -5. Next is 0. The next is 2. The next is 3, and 4, and 5. The range, -1, seems to be the least. So we have that, and then we have 1 twice. So we're only going to list it once. And then we have 2 twice. So we're only going to list that once. And then we have 3. And that's it for the range. The domain here for this one is -5, which is the least. 0 occurs twice, but you only list it once. 1, 2, and 3. And we have the range. Range is -5. We're going to start with that. And then we're going to go to 3. And then we're going to go to, nope, we're going to go to 2. And then we're going to go to 3. And then we're going to go to 4, which occurs twice, but we're only going to list it once, and then 6. And the last 2, domain and range. So we're going to just go ahead here. This is -2. It occurs twice, so we're going to list it once, then 1, then a 2. These are all the x values, and then a 6, listing from least to greatest. Then we're going to list the y values. So we're going to go -5. That's the least, the lowest value on the y. Then we're going to go up to -1 on the y. Then we're going to go up to 2. See 2 on the y. And then 3 occurs twice, but we're only going to list it once. If you listed all of these coordinates out, you would see exactly that my domain and range came from the coordinates, the x and y, of the coordinates. So here we go with the domain. So the domain is the list of all the x's. So the leftmost part of the graph, this starts at this leftmost, it goes -2. All right, -2, comma, and the rightmost part of the graph is 1. They are both closed circles, so we are going to put a a bracket around both. The range is a list of all the y's, so we're going to go down to the lowest point on the y, and we see that it is -1. The lowest point of the y. The highest point on the y-axis, the highest this graph goes, is 4, and that is a closed circle, so we have that as far as the range goes. All right, and that is it. That ends the assignment, and I hope that helped. Watch that to get all the questions that you could not answer. Hopefully that helped, and I'll see you next time.